Yeah, bado siwezi nini. Good afternoon again. Sorry for the delay in starting, but I can see more people have joined in, so I believe we can start now. So today's webinar is about public debt, understanding multilateral loans from international financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and the Africa Development Bank. So I'm just sharing the program. The objective of this meeting is to sensitize civil society organizations on multilateral loans from IFIs. And yeah, so we can begin by introductions. My name is Christine Akenyi, and I work with the Institute for Social Accountability. Our national coordinator is not able to join us today. I'll request my colleagues, George and Maria, to introduce themselves, then we move on to the other participants.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Wangondo, and I work with the Institute for Social Accountability. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is George Odera, and I work for the Institute for Social Accountability. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nona Tamale. I will be presenting today.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Gogo. I work with Oxfam in Kenya.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Duda. I'm with Okoa, Mombasa.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winnie Nkatha. I work with the Institute of Public Finance, Kenya.
Good afternoon. This is Christian Donaldson. I work with Oxfam and based in Washington, D.C., policy advisor on IFIs.
Diana, have you introduced yourself? Okay, Adrian, can you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I hope I'm the Adrian you're talking about. My name is Adrian Chikore. I work within AFRODAT, African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, leading the international public finance portfolio. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So now I'll just give a brief overview of the Okoa Uchumi campaign. So basically, we are concerned, as civil society, we are concerned about Kenya's rising debt and the high repayments, which are eating into revenue, which is supposed to go into finance public sector spending. So we just came together as civil society organization to advocate for debt transparency and accountability. And with support from Oxfam, we've also been engaging with international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Earlier in the year, we met with IMF just to discuss the standby facility that they were negotiating with the government. Then when COVID hit, again, we reached out to IMF just demanding transparency for them to ensure transparency and accountability in the funds that they had disbursed to Kenya. We also wrote to the World Bank with regards to the SCD process and CPF process, and we hope to meet with them within the month of November. So as the coalition, we've been doing a lot of advocacy with IFIs, and during one of the coalition meetings, it was felt that there's need for to strengthen the capacity of civil society. So as we engage with these IFIs, we engage from a point of knowledge and understanding of how they work. And then also, we also hope to, after these learning sessions, to improve on our advocacy strategy with IFIs. So this is the first learning session. We hope to hold 2 more within the month of November. So today is just the introduction bit of it, where we'll just try and understand some of the facilities by IFIs, and we are privileged to have with us facilitators who understand how IFIs work, and they will explain to us. So our first presenter is Nona Tamale, who is a legal and policy research consultant specializing in the intersection between development finance, public policy, and human rights. So she'll be explaining to us type of IFI facilities, amounts, rates, maturity dates, and what are the potential fiscal measures. And then our second speaker is Christian Donaldson, who is a policy advisor. He works with Oxfam America. So we'll start with the first presentation is from Nona Tamale. So Nona, yeah, you can proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Christine. Once again, my name is Nona Tamale, and like Christine introduced me, I originally previously, just a few months ago, worked at Oxfam International in Washington, DC with Christian's team. Hi, Christian. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me and for organizing this. So originally, my presentation, as Christine has shown in the program, was going to cover just the facilities and the rates, basically looking at the Kenyan situation. So what is the Kenyan situation with IFIs right now, especially with the COVID context, and what fiscal measures to expect. But I decided to just broaden it, and if I would do the introduction of the IMF financing as well, and then I'll hand over to Christian to do the World Bank part and the advocacy strategies. So, I don't know if I can share my screen or if that's a preserve of the speakers, but I'll try. Oh, here we go. Can everyone hear me? I feel like I'm talking to myself. Hello.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so generally, I'll just kick it off and get right into it. Just a brief overview. I know Christine mentioned that you have been engaging with the IMF already, so this might not be new information, but just an overview of the type of development financing the IMF is into. So the IMF is sort of a lender of last resort. It comes in situations where there are crises. So in the COVID situation is a good example. And usually where countries have economic and financial instability, the IMF will come in to lend support, financial support to countries. And usually that support comes with associated policies that a country is expected to take so as to improve their economic stability at the time. And unlike the World Bank and the African Development Bank, which is usually project-based, their financing is usually in situations where there's a crisis and is attached to policy. And so in this case, the government and the IMF agree beforehand, like Christine mentioned, and discuss a program of economic policies that a country will take to improve their financial situation. And usually that will be instances where a country can't afford to pay for its imports or can't afford to service its external debt, which many countries are at risk of right now. So this as Christine mentioned earlier on, during the year, Kenya had been in negotiations with the IMF for a new program. And so that's what usually happens. The government and the IMF will agree on a program of economic policies and the financing package prior to the lending. And once they have agreed, the board approves and the loan comes, and it comes with policies that the government should pursue. And that those are usually what we call the conditionality. And that's just the actions, the policy actions that a government commits to take, which is why in this case, it's important to know where the IMF stands on different policies, because then it will be advising governments in accordance to the policies that it believes it should take. So where we'll say, for instance, the IMF should be looking at issues of inequality, that's important, because if they are considering that, then that will reflect in the advice that they ask government, that they offer governments, and the policies that they expect governments to take. So, again, membership is by quota. I'm sure that we know, and it determines how much lending you get. That's important for later on in the discussion, where we're going to discuss how much financing Kenya got, for instance. There's concessional financing for low-income countries, and those are specific loan programs. So there are different facilities, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and each of them have a program for low-income countries and a program for high-income countries. And usually the low-income countries have specific facilities that they can take, that they can obtain. So I'll go straight into the financing situation, the public debt right now from IFIs, specifically the IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank for the COVID period, right? And then briefly discuss the implications of this debt for the COVID recovery. And Christian can chip in at whatever point, just let me know. So for the IMF, the figure was 739 million. It was an outright disbursement. So what that means is the whole amount is given to the government because it was an emergency. It's part of emergency financing, which was the Rapid Credit Facility. Now that's a facility that's given to low-income countries during crises like the COVID crisis qualified. And they could get up to 100% of their quota. Like I said, the quota is how much is your membership, the percentage you have, and how much you contribute, you pay to the IMF. And so that Kenya received 100% of its quota. Now, for this particular facility, if you only get 100% of your quota annually. So what that means is Kenya cannot go back to the IMF for emergency financing until a year has passed. And so if they received it in May 2020, it's only until May 2021 when they can get this financing. Now, this financing is more concessional compared to the other financing, of course, in the private sector side. And because this particular one is 0% interest rate, and the repayment period the maturity period is 10 years, and they have a 5 years grace period, which means Kenya will start making its payments in 2025 to 2030. So that's just a brief description of the IMF loan. The purpose of the loan was for budget support. So it was given straight to the treasury to use during COVID period for whatever COVID related spending. And in terms of transparency, which is where civil society comes in, where we monitor how this money is being used, the government committed to have post-crisis auditing and to publish the results as well as procurement. So for the World Bank, and again, Christian will just give a brief overview of the World Bank financing. So I'll just go straight to the World Bank loan for Kenya. So again, 50 million is what they received, and the interest rate is 1.25 per annum and they have a 5-year window within which to withdraw the money. It was part of the investment project financing, so it's project-based. This is a particular project for COVID health financing, which is different from other types of facilities the World Bank may have, which like the development policy one, which is associated to policies. So this was specifically for a project. Again, similar to the IMF, they have a 5 years grace period, and repayment will commence in 2025 for every 6 months until 2049. So there's a 25-year maturity period, and this is part of the concessional finance that's given to low-income countries. And that comes from IDA. IDA is the International Development Association, which is the World Bank branch that lends to low-income countries. The purpose of this financing, just a brief overview, was purely health related. And so you can just skim through and also follow up, monitor. Part of, again, civil society's role is to monitor whether this money is actually being used for each of these components. So those are some of the components that were in the loan documents. Again, for transparency, there will be annual audits. The government committed to annual audits, which should be available for people review. Moving on to the African Development Bank, Kenya received 188 million euros, and that interest rate of 0.37%. And the type of facility, similar to the IMF, they came up with a rapid response facility to respond to help countries to respond to the crisis. And it's also going to be disbursed in one tranche, one disbursement. And the maturity period is 25 years. However, this time for this particular one, Kenya has 8 years grace period to repay, and a 16.7 year, almost 17 years maturity. So what that means is they'll have to, when the time after the 8-year grace period, there'll be 34 consecutive payments from 2028 to 2020 to 45. So what to note here, again, from a debt perspective, is to look at the overlap of the debt payments. So between 2025 to 2049, there's going to be consistent payments, and that doesn't even include any further projects that they're going to have from, or any further lending they'll get from these institutions. So for the purpose of the lending, particularly for the African Development Bank, like the IMF, it's also budget support. However, it's specifically linked to health system, economic resilience, that is support for small businesses, small and medium businesses, and enhancing social protection, i.e. support for vulnerable groups and communities who would need support to survive through the COVID crisis. Again, transparency, there's room, they provide for special audit and will publish procurements. Now, just from an overview of looking at the debt situation, the next big question would be, so what are the implications of this debt in the, in the COVID recovery period? So for the IMF, it's very specific. When you look at their loan documentation, the proposals that they have for the Kenyan government are to resume fiscal consolidation, which the Kenyan government had embarked on, and to reverse some of the COVID measures, i.e. tax relief. I'm not sure what's happening on the ground, but from the policy, from the documents, it says there was relief on VAT, I think. And so that's something that the IMF would want the government to reverse as soon as possible. And also to reverse the measures like the transfers that were implemented for COVID period. And then also one of the other proposals is raising revenues. They're not clear though on what type of revenues, like they are in certain other countries. So for certain other countries like Mozambique, there are commitments to raise VAT, for instance, but for Kenya, it's open to the government. And so that's something to look out for in case they're pushing for raising of indirect taxation. And this would have to be looked at in the response of the government on the ground. And on that note, would like to share, if anyone is interested, I will share this presentation, and there is a link in the Oxfam data set on IMF COVID financing that we compiled on information spending, transparency, and recovery measures. And that includes the section on Kenya. So for the Kenyan section, you will see what the government committed to spend on the transparency measures and what they are proposing to do during the recovery period. So are we expecting any more emergency financing? So emergency financing generally has been more concessional, especially with the IMF, for example. And I know there's a situation of, right now there's the issue of payment of external debt and the debt crisis, the looming debt crisis, if not already actually ongoing crisis. And so one of the questions is, can countries go back to IFIs for further lending, since the terms would definitely be much better than they are on the private market, and from bonds, for instance, and other private creditors. And just to note, for instance, for the IMF loans, they have reached their lending is limited by quotas. And so for Kenya, they reached their annual limit. And if they wanted to get more money from the IMF, they would have to continue negotiations for a further loan program. And what that means is that a further loan program could come with conditionalities. One thing I didn't mention is for the rapid credit facility, which is what IMF gave to Kenya, there are no conditionalities generally for emergency financing, since it's needed for it's urgent rapid financing. And so if we're getting any further financing after that, then it would have most probably be the usual other IMF facilities which are associated with conditionalities. And that's something to look out for, because then the government would be making commitments in terms of policy. And those are things to, especially on because they want to pay debt. So we're going to have to be looking at issues of, for instance, raising revenues, which they have either way proposed to be doing. So that's something for civil society to be looking out for and being active with following up with the IMF and following up with the government to see what the next loan program will entail. And then there's also the risk of austerity. And what do we mean by austerity? So both the IMF and the African Development Bank are recommending resumption of fiscal consolidation, which means generally reducing your spending. So you're reducing spending and trying to limit debt, external debt. And so that means that we're probably going to see issues of cutting crucial social spending like health to be able to bring down the deficit right now. And in most cases where there has been austerity, it has also been known that the easiest pie to cut, the easiest portion to cut from is health and education, which already don't get enough funding as it is in most African countries. And so that's something to look out for as well. The government of Kenya, however, specifically stated in their loan document to the IMF that they will reduce spending. However, they would do it in a way that does not affect the quality of public services or their Big Four agenda. I know that people on the call are familiar with the Big Four agenda. I think it includes health, housing, education. I don't remember the fourth one. But so they claim they won, but in the past, when you look at austerity, it usually comes with cuts in health and education. So that's also definitely something to look out for. And so at this point, I will take on any questions or hand over to Christian if he wants to add something at this point quickly on the World Bank side before he then either way proceeds on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nona, for the good presentation. These are some really good points, especially on the conditionalities attached to financing from IFIs. So at this point, kindly ask your questions if you have any. Okay.
Maybe we can proceed with Christian and then maybe have questions at the end at once.
Okay. Yeah, so we can proceed to the next presenter. Yeah, but if you have any questions, please include them just type them out in the chat box. Thank you. Christian, you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Hi, Nona. So nice to see you again. This is Christian Donaldson. And I will start just by trying to share some of our experience in terms of advocacy strategies and influencing these institutions. I work with Oxfam International. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm a policy advisor on IFIs. So the mandate of our office within the Oxfam Confederation is basically to work on advocacy efforts towards the World Bank group and IMF. Our office is a small office, and I'm mostly in charge on issues related to the World Bank, on issues related to climate change, civic space, financial institutions. But for the presentation today, I'm going to try to just have some overall reflections in terms of influencing and advocacy strategies towards these institutions. I'm gonna just share also. Let's see if this works. Can you see on the screen the presentation?
Yes, yes, Christian,
Yes.
we can see the screen.
Can.
Okay, great. So this is a general presentation that we usually use at the office. So I'm going to skip several of these. What is happening here? Okay, I'm going to skip several of these slides and just go to the ones that go into the reflections of advocacy. In terms of the International Monetary Fund, I'm not going to repeat much. I mean, Nona did a great job explaining the institution. I just want to focus on one aspect that I think is important when influencing these institutions is that understanding the institution. These institutions are not monolithic, and it's critical in order to influence them to understand the organizational structure of them and see within the institution map out who has decision-making power, where in the administration has specific roles and on specific loans or on specific operations, and also understanding the reporting lines within the structure, internal structure of these institutions, because that really is an important tool when we engage with these institutions in terms of scaling up the engagement from different officers of the institution at different moments and trying to convince them on different paths that within our advocacy work we are doing. So I just wanted to emphasize that by showing this slide of the IMF structure, in which you can see there are different areas and departments, services and support services. But all this, for instance, all this area here is considered management. And then you have about here what are the areas in which the high level decision making of the institutions are, including the board of directors, which are usually members of our own countries from the Ministry of Finance, usually, that sits there and oversee the day-to-day operations of these institutions. On the World Bank side, the same. It's understanding the institution. The World Bank group is called a group because it's basically a group of 5 different institutions, and this graphic just represents that. Understanding who are the board of governors, usually the ministers of finance and education, finance and economy of our own countries sit there. And the institutions have the board of directors, who are based in Washington, D.C., in charge of the day-to-day decision making of all this, of the operations of these institutions. And as I mentioned, it's a World Bank group because they have 5 different institutions, 2 from the public sector that only give loans to the government. The government is considered their client. One is IBRD, that gives basically near market rate loan. The other one is IDA, as you might know very well, that is the concessional part of the bank. But the other 2 institutions that are part of there are IFC and MIGA, that only give financial support to the private sector. But these institutions are supposed to work together. So that's one of the important areas that I wanted to emphasize. In order to influence this institution, it's critical to understand all these levels of the structure within them. In terms of the World Bank, very quickly, it's a lender, gives money to governments and private sector. That's where their leverage lays. It's also the preferred administrator of funds. As you know, many donor countries create specific funds or trust funds for specific areas. And who is the one who they ask to manage those funds is the World Bank. They give technical assistance, and because their huge network of contacts within governments, academy, research, and all that, they have a very important role in terms of knowledge brokers or gatekeepers. They have contacts with so many different areas within the development world that combined with their lending operations and administration of funds, it gives them a lot of influence and leverage. So that is where these institutions are so important, and it's important to, to do advocacy work on them. But as you know, this is a new world right now. I mean, so many things have changed in the last 10 years. And these two institutions, at least World Bank Group and IMF, have gained new relevance given the new international commitments, global commitments within the SDGs, Paris Agreement. They are gaining a lot of new roles on this. In terms of the World Bank Group, one of the main roles that now is being taxed by the governors of the bank is leveraging private sector money, because the rhetoric that there's not enough money to fulfill the SDGs and Paris Agreement within the public funding, so they need to leverage the private funding. But at the same time, for instance, the World Bank Group is facing a lot of competition from other institutions. In the past, they were the only lenders for governments, but now you can have a variety of actors, new actors like other MDBs and multilateral development banks that have been created within the last 5 years. So they are facing a lot of competition and things like that. So I had a couple of things on World Bank COVID, although Nona can explain very well many aspects of this, but just she did a great job on IMF. Just to go into the World Bank, just to mention that they have committed also a huge amount of money, $160 billion for the next period of next year until June 2021. And all that is only for COVID. The COVID response has 3 phases: the emergency response relief that Mona explained, in which they have 14 million allocated for that for countries, mostly on areas of health. But now they are restructuring themselves to go into the next second phase and third phase of what they call COVID response, which is restructuring and recovery, and then build back better or resilient recovery, in which this $160 billion is going to play a huge role. Areas of priority that the bank is considering for this is now still health, but also including social protection, economic growth, job creation, policy, and institutional reform. So all this is coming within the next 15 months. So it's important to understand all that. Repeat this, so I'm going to skip that. One thing that we've been hearing from IMF is that one of the main advices that they are giving at this moment for recovery is spend, 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 but keep the receipt. That was the message also within the last, the just finalized annual meetings. As Nona mentioned, in this new phase, through the pandemic, there were a lot of support in terms of finance lending with few conditions, but hints of austerity. But now the concern is that more of that is coming, and there's a lot of discussion during the use of those funds and anti-corruption measures. But now that the recovery phase is coming, there is also a lot of conversations in terms of more spending and more conditionalities coming. So just to complement that with what Nona has said. Now, in terms of some of the reflections of our work, the overall objective for us in terms of engaging with this institution is basically to promote and push these institutions to promote and implement more progressive policies and programs that prioritize the interests of the poorest people. and reduce inequalities, do no harm, and have positive impact. And why we engage with them is because that fundamental role in shaping the development agenda and pathways on our countries, as using their leverage, as mentioned before, in terms of not just of lending, but in terms of policy advice and technical support that they offer within, along with their money. And the point of leverage for our advocacy work is understanding that most of these institutions have a very poverty focused and sustainable development mandate. So that gives us all the room to push for accountability of this public money and to push them for transparency, for accountability in general in terms of how they use this money, the use of this money is and where it is going. And that's how we engage with them. In terms of what we can share of our experience, the first thing is that no one institution can engage alone and try to influence these giant institutions. As I mentioned, they are non-monolithic, so a coalition work is critical for the advocacy work. And working in partnership with other allies is a key aspect of this. Allow us to, each of the different organizations basically bring their unique approach and strategies and address the institutions from different angles, from different perspectives, and in a coordinated way. That's one of the main critical strategies that is important to always keep in mind. The second, as I mentioned, is understanding the institutions, how they work, who makes decisions. So a power map analysis of the institutions is one of the most important tools that we have when engaging on advocacy. Through this power analysis, understanding who reports to who makes the decisions, who has leverage over who within the institution. As I said, they are not monolithic. Even within the institutions, we can find allies that can help us to push internally. And within this power map analysis, is critical to, in parallel, do the advocacy planning, which means basically to understand exactly when and how, at what moment, bring the message that we want to bring to them, and how different angles can support the message. It's important to understand and know that these institutions, the role that the institutions have within their headquarters here in Washington, and the level of openness to civil society is a bit different than when within their country offices. And that's why this coordinated work within allies and partners at the national level and with folks that are based in Washington is critical, because the difference of their understanding of civil society is quite pronounced, depending on whether it's headquarters or whether it's in their country offices. The other important thing that we have learned over years of advocacy is critical to have a strong evidence-based research. These institutions take that well, respect strong evidence-based research and analysis, and that's critical to have a level-based discussion and dialogue with them in many aspects. And I'm sure all this is basically very familiar with you guys, but I just thought that it was important just to repeat some of these aspects. Another thing that we think is very critical and important sometimes is underestimated is we need to always stay up to date to the latest things that are happening within this institution. Be aware, for instance, of what the high-level decision maker of these institutions are saying publicly or within communicates what kind of internal reforms are happening within these institutions. These institutions are really huge inside. I mean, the World Bank has overall around the world about 10,000 employees. So that means that every year there are changes in terms of the directors or vice presidents, the people who make decisions. And it's critical to understand that. It's critical to understand what is happening internally and what kind of message they are bringing publicly to find entry points for or pressure points for advocacy. It's also critical, the use of media is very effective in many aspects because these institutions have a really care a lot about their reputation. And the work with media, in our experience, is not just about doing external media about naming and shaming with them, but it's also in terms of building relationships with media, with journalists, in terms of having that relationship so they can, when these institutions make new announcements or changes, they can seek to you in terms of looking for reflections, interviews, and explanations of what is happening. And that is critical in terms of the work that we do using media. And social media, in many aspects, is also critical. The bank has proved that they are always looking to the social media that at least our colleagues and us are putting out in terms of what they are doing. The next point I mentioned already in terms of what's happening at the headquarter levels and national country offices. It's always critical to understand that difference. And the last point is basically, in summary, is in order to engage with these institutions and influence them, it's important to understand that it's not a one-off opportunity, or that it's important to take in place, but it is about building relationships within the institution. As I mentioned, these institutions are not monolithic, so there is plenty of opportunities to find internal allies that can help us or help and bring the message to them, to their high-level decision-making aspect. So it's about building relationships. It's not just sending one email and try to get a meeting, but it's trying to knock the door several times. It's about sharing different areas of intel or news and updates from back and forth, and that way generate that relationship that's needed to understand institutions and to influence it. So it's a lot of that. I want to finish just with a couple of tips and cautions about engagement with them that we've learned over the years. The way that the headquarters, at least of these institutions, work nowadays is not the same that happened maybe 10 years ago. They were very close institutions, difficult to penetrate, but now they have opened quite a lot. But what we are seeing is that now they are trying to steer all the civil society engagement and contacts with their external relations or communication staff. So in a way, they are trying to kind of put a gatekeeper on the relationships and engagement with civil society, and that's an important aspect to be aware always. Although external relations or communication staff from these institutions can be important, helpful points of contact and assist us on understanding or getting to the right person. At the end of the day, they are not the ones who hold the decision power of this institution. So it's always important to insist and to do the power map analysis and understand who is the right person that we need to talk, that we need to engage with, who is the one who bears decision-making powers within those institutions, and try to go directly to those contact those people. Also, another thing that we have been seeing lately is that even though these institutions now are getting a little bit more open in terms of engaging with civil society in different areas, they kind of misrepresent consultation processes. What is the meaning of meaningful consultation with civil society? They often will accept or schedule or a meeting with a group of civil society, and all of a sudden after that, we will find out that they are calling that informal meeting a consultation process with civil society. So it's important to understand that, because every time that we engage or request a meeting with them, it's important to be aware of that situation, and always put forward and propose to them what is our idea of engaging with civil society, what is our idea, what we want from a consultation process, and on the engagement of this is critical, that aspect. And also, it's important that to understand that even though they are becoming a little bit more open, as I mentioned before, they still have some kind of shortcomings on their engagement with civil society. Quite often they don't disseminate or disclose relevant or important information before any meetings or any consultation that civil society has requested with them. And the invitation, they send invitation for a meeting within just days or hours of the meeting without sending any other information. That is something that is very often that happens. And in order to influence and plan your advocacy strategies, it's critical to have always that in mind. And as I mentioned, have a clear understanding and idea and convey that idea to them in regular basis of how that engagement with civil society within should be, and what kind of information they should be disclosing ahead of any meeting, so civil society comes prepared to those meetings to engage in dialogue and discussion. I think that's all I have for now in terms of reflections and what we have learned from our engagement with these institutions, and in terms of influence and advocacy strategies. I'll leave it there, and in case you have any other questions, and well, thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah, thank you, Christian, for the good presentation. You've raised some very important points that as the Okoa Uchumi coalition we need to look at. I hope you'll share with us the presentation for our reference, and also to share with the coalition members who are not able to make it today. So now, okay, thank you. So are there any questions from the participants to the presenters, both Christian and Nona?
Yes, thank you, Christine, and thank you very much, Christian, for that wonderful presentation. It was very insightful, and I've actually learned a lot about the advocacy strategies and how to position yourself as civil society. So one of the things that was just running through my mind with regards to the process is that many civil society organizations, when they are working on a specific project, it has a timeline, so it tends to come to an end either because of funding constraints or maybe taking on new priorities. So how would you advise with just tying the point on being consistent with IFIs, how would you advise civil society organizations to have sustainability with regards to campaigns, when it comes to campaigns, whether you have funding or not? because again, one of the challenges is if it's project-based, then it means the project comes to an end, then maybe in future you restart it and you've lost touch with some of the gains that you had made with the IFI. And then it would also be good to know with regards to alliances, how national-based civil society organizations or local-based civil society organizations can be able to link up with some of these international bodies, for example, Oxfam, the UNs, where they can have more influence as opposed to going as national coalitions. I'm not saying that national coalitions don't have a chance, but from what you've presented with regards to alliances, how can they be part of this broader, larger global movement to put pressure on IFIs with regards to accountability? So how can that space be opened up so that national and local civil society organizations can be part of the broader advocacy agenda? And then another interesting point that you raised with regards to the evidence-based, how is it that we can be able to track some of the recommendations, especially when you talk about research? You give recommendations to IFIs, but as civil society, and maybe from your practice, how can you advise with regards to tracking some of these recommendations that we've given to IFIs? So I'll ask that for now. And then for the first presenter, Nona, sorry, I wasn't able to hear the first bit of your presentation, but I was very curious to learn about the ranking of Kenya with regards to World Bank and IMF. Where are we ranked? Are we still ranked as heavily indebted, or are we ranked as the middle income, where we can be able to, where we are seen to be able to pay off the debt? And what does this mean for us as a country with regards to ranking? And then the other question I had for you, Nona, was what do these concessions mean for Kenya, especially the last point you made about not having any more free loans if we take up another one? What does it mean for Kenya moving forward? Thank you.
Hello, Christian. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I can take very quickly the first question. Thank you, Yana. Those are really very important questions because go to the core of one of the main challenges that CSOs, NGOs, and even community level organizations face in a day-to-day basis on trying to engage with these institutions. The sustainability of the engagement is a major challenge, as well as how to track those recommendations or once we engage with them. But I think in many aspects, one of them, I would say, I believe in that one of the main areas on how to overcome that is the first point that I mentioned, which is basically work in coalitions. That is a critical aspect because each individual organization will face these challenges in many areas, but by working in coalition, by working with partners, and each of these institutions bring different areas of their unique approach and strategies, and even sustainability of the effort. It's in many aspects is inevitable that some organizations, for instance, small organizations, local organizations, won't have the resources to constant engagement, and that is pretty much natural sometimes, but it's critical always to maintain a relationship with within a coalition, because there are other organizations that will be engaging in different areas and trying to maintain those relationships with this organization. Before I worked with Oxfam, I worked for 8 years on a smaller, way more smaller organization with maybe 20 people there. And that is the challenge that we face all the time. So what we learned there is critical to partner, to have allies, to be part of different list serves, different update meetings, and just keep being within a minimal way, at least involved and understanding what are the changes that are happening in these institutions. That's critical, working coalitions. In terms of the recommendations within research-based that we have, then again, in order to track how that, whether it's changing, whether the recommendations are taken into account, the only way is maintaining a constant engagement with these institutions. One of the challenges that and risks that happens is that sometimes we come up with a report, we launch the report with an event, we invite maybe one person from these institutions to respond, and because the limited resources, sometimes we leave it in that way after that. But it's critical that after those initiatives or launching reports or having meetings with them within a month, within 2 weeks, depending on many different aspects, it's always important to knock again the doors and just remind them what is going on, what happened with the situation. And even though in many aspects that also is a challenge, because that's part of the first question. It's important for that reason, to work in coalition and divide responsibilities, tasks, and then regroup again. I'm sure this answer is not super exciting, but it's in our experience is one of the most critical aspects of influence in this institution. In our work, it's not just, for instance, our office in DC in Oxfam, or every day we try to coordinate with so many different organizations that are doing or trying to engage with these institutions on different areas. So that's critical, it's coalition work. Thank you.
All right, so I will respond to Diana's questions on the first one on the ranking of Kenya. There were 2 parts to that question. So the first was on debt and the classification, the ranking of Kenya right now. So Kenya it's definitely right now at high risk of debt distress. But nonetheless, it was able to secure financing from IFIs because they argue that the debt is sustainable. So for now, because of the crisis, and most countries which are either at high risk of debt distress or even in debt distress, like Mozambique, were able to secure financing from IFIs, although it won't be as easy to secure from private creditors when you have been classified as at high risk of distress. Now, what that means then in the long run is that when we are in the recovery period or moving past COVID, we're going to see more policies actually aimed towards reducing debt. And so again, going back to the advice of the IMF to have austerity, which means cut and spend less so that you can pay your debt, or collect more revenues so that you can pay your debt. So hence, we're going to see, going back to one of the proposals that are being made for the recovery period will be raising revenues, and it is a possibility that could include indirect taxation like VAT, although the IMF is saying more, they are promoting and pushing for governments to consider progressive taxation, which should be the ideal situation. There are other loan programs where they're pushing for indirect taxes like VAT, so that's something to look out for, because it's going to be, especially for countries like Kenya, which have a high debt distress, it's going to be ways of cutting expenditure as much as possible. So that's definitely something to look out for in the future. For the other ranking that you talked about, Kenya being a lower middle income country, so that's classification for the World Bank. And so that determines the kind of financing that they receive from the World Bank. So like Christian explained, the World Bank has different, it's a group because it has different institutions. Now, low income countries get funded from the International Development Association, IDA, and they get concessional finance. Lower middle income countries also qualify for, like Kenya in particular qualifies for that concessional finance, but they also qualify for the amount, the finance that middle income countries would get, which is from the IBRD, International Bank of Reconstruction for Development. Is that the right? Yeah, IBRD. And so they can get like a blend of both instruments. So that's just the technical part, but essentially they are still eligible for concessional finance. Now, what takes, that's from the World Bank, whereas from the IMF, Kenya is classified as low-income country, and so they receive concessional finance, and they only receive facilities that are specifically, they qualify for facilities that are specifically for low-income countries, although depending on the negotiations with the IMF, they can also get other facilities, but they are specific facilities for low-income countries as well. So I hope that's clear. So just carrying this whole discussion into what this means for Kenya, the position for Kenya, when I say, I think you said something like no more free loans. I'd say no more, well, definitely they're not getting as concessional as they were getting, or as urgent relief as they got during the COVID period. So for sure, most of these institutions had leeway during this period because of COVID. So like the bank, it was fast track facility, same with the IMF, same with African Development Bank. And so when we are going into the next phase, like Christian explained in the World Bank, for instance, where they're discussing restructuring, we're most likely going to see a different type of facility. Same with the IMF, like I explained already, they would still be eligible for concessional finance, but it just won't have as much flexibility or no conditionalities, for instance, or no requirements, fixed policy actions that they have to take. And so, again, taking us back to the debt discussion, you're going to then see policies that the IMF could be pushing for to ensure that the debt comes down to at least moderate levels. And definitely one of the keys, having reviewed the loan agreement, the loan instrument, for all countries, for IMF loans, one key thing that we're still going through countries, especially those at high risk of debt distress, was advice to cut funding. And so then going back to civil society and what we're interested in, you're looking at social spending being cut, taxes being increased, and our worry right now is indirect taxes at a time when people have already been affected by the pandemic. And so these are some of the things to look out for. I hope I'm able to answer your question.
Okay. Thank you, Nona and Christian, for answering the questions. I have a few questions, and yeah, the participants can also ask questions if they have any. So with regards to understanding where this IFI stands on different policies, is there like, where can we get information to understand more on some of these conditionalities that they put on debt financing, so that we, even as civil society, we can know, like, for instance, IMF, they always propose austerity measures. So is there, okay, yeah, where can we get this information just to understand some of their positions on such issues? And then also the question on, okay, normally when we meet with these IFIs, they really insist on evidence to support our arguments. So most CSOs rely a lot on government documents, but you find that even IFIs have raised concerns about some of the data in government documents. They don't speak to each other. You find that they normally produce these documents at different times. So you find that a document produced in January and a document produced in April, the information is not in sync. So even as civil society, we face that challenge in terms of even reviewing government documents. So even their data is a bit not aligned to each other. So in terms of evidence, how can we improve on that? And yeah, those are my 2 questions.
Okay, so I'll respond to the first one, and then I think Christian will take the second one. So on understanding where the IMF stands, that's a very good question. And the different ways of determining this. For starters, there's some well-known positions that the IMF has always been known to take, for instance. And so when you talk about austerity, you know that when countries are going through crisis or difficulty, economic instability, they will, in most cases, be pushing for countries to reduce their expenditure so that they can be able to pay more debt, right? And so you're looking for that's already a starting point. If we are cutting expenditure, you're then looking at whether they are pushing for cutting. Sometimes they'll say, well, they actually say governments should save social services, and that's something that you can find. So what are the ways of finding this information? IMF carries out surveillance. So one of their roles in that presentation today, we've mainly covered lending because today we were talking about financing. But another role of the IMF is surveillance, and what they do is conduct a survey. They do an analysis and consult with people in respective countries, stakeholders, in respective countries. So that could include the economic and financial actors, the bank, central banks, economic and finance ministries. They should include civil society during surveillance, and they come up with a document called Article 4. Now, these are available on the IMF website for each country. So which could be great for civil society. Like a first step is you can go to the IMF website and find the Article 4s for Kenya in the previous years and see where the IMF has been standing, where they have been leaning, what kind of policies they have been pushing for at a country level in Kenya. So that's definitely a good starting point. Right now, you can also access, because of the COVID loan, you can actually look through the loan document itself. It's very clear. It will provide a staff report. In that staff report, you see what the IMF staff agreed and negotiated with the country, with the government, and it also shows the government request for financing, and that also shows you what commitment the government is making, and so you get to see for yourself, and that's also evidence. When you present it, you say, well, the Kenyan government said they're doing this and this, and we now see on the ground XYZ, and you're able to link that in your advocacy, and so that's definitely, that would be very, very helpful. A third place to look is definitely looking out on the IMF website. They have reports, they have policy papers that they're always releasing on different themes to show where they stand at a global level. So that trickles down. Essentially, that's supposed to trickle down and inform the way country offices work. But at least from my experience while I was still at Oxfam, something we always noted was what's happening at the global level doesn't always necessarily translate to country level. And so at the global level, you might have IMF officials talking about inequality. It's important to consider inequality when you're looking at surveillance or financing, and it's all talk because it then isn't going to translate into action or policy if the country level officials, like Christian showed in the structure and the hierarchy, if it's not, that talk is not happening at the country level. And so another very important thing about the next point for understanding where IMF stands would be to also connect with CSOs that are working at a global level and working on IMF issues. This is important because they are able to bring evidence from the ground, from CSOs who are working in Kenya, who say, well, if we saw this in our Article 4, or we've had negotiations between the IMF and the World Bank on this, what do you think? What's happening at a global level? Or you could also help to connect with people at a global level who can then connect with the executive director who is a country at a country level, you know, and then you're able to liaise. And also sometimes during the annual meetings is a good period when annual meetings and spring meetings, although now it's been virtual, but it would be a good meeting for civil society from the ground to meet with global civil society and meet with IMF officials on the ground and be able to interact with the different officials from those who work at a country level and those who work at a global level. So those are just some of the ideas that come to mind. Maybe Christian, if you have any others that you can share.
Thank you, Nona. I think you covered a lot of on your answer. I just would like to compliment on saying that yeah, this transparency and disclosure of information is been always for me the cornerstone of everything that we do in terms of advocacy, and in many aspects that is the first demand or ask to these institutions to continue improving that. In terms of the challenge of what you mentioned about the quality of the data, or how the data varies from one month to another, is an important challenge. And these institutions have access to different type of formal databases, but they also have internal policies in terms of disclosure information and transparency, especially World Bank that I know most, but I'm sure IMF has something too. So it's always important to rely on those policies. And in terms of data, I mean, that is, as they rely on public data to do their own analysis, that means that data is public. One of the requests that you can do and ask them is also to release some of the data so that you have it to compare or to do your own analysis, independent analysis using the same data. That's something that in many aspects, at least within the World Bank, it will be the type of information that is within their own access to information policy. The World Bank has a specific portal or in their website that people can request any information through a formal channel. And according to the access to information policy, it has, it lays out all the steps that needs to happen in terms of once you submit a request for information, how long you should be waiting for acknowledging of the request and how long you should be waiting for that information to be disclosed to you. And in case that that information that you requested is not disclosed, the policy also have a specific clauses in terms of the steps to appeal, again, in case that that data for any reason wasn't disclosed. So that's something that just could work again in terms of seeking data and in terms of also the quality of it. And as Nona mentioned, one of the aspects that we within our engagement with these institutions is that we try to corroborate with meetings a lot of this information. Sometimes operations are in the very initial phase. Sometimes the documentation is not yet released by these institutions, but by having constant meetings or requesting meetings with the right people is when we try to get intel ahead of that. Sometimes, as I mentioned, you can find allies that will give you that information, and sometimes it won't happen, but it's part of the advocacy work in many aspects to use all these tools, requests through information data through the formal channels, corroborate it or get intel through informal meetings, and again, double check all the information and data through other partners and coalition members. And there are institutions that gather all that data within the national context, independently or So it's kind of a game on that, but that's more or less some of the reflections I can share now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions. There's a question from Riva. She's asking, are the conditionalities ever related to tackling IFIs?
So I'll take that one. So usually
IFFs.
Hello?
Hi, sorry. IFFs, illicit financial flows, not I5. Sorry.
No.
sorry.
I'm saying yes, IFFs, international, illicit financial flows, right?
Yes.
Yes, so I was saying, yes, the IMF does talk about illicit financial flows as one of the areas that it wants to have, to track at a country level. And usually, you'd have to look at the particular loan documentation to see whether it depends on a country level. I reviewed a few IMF loans, at least for COVID, and maybe because it was for COVID period, I didn't get to see that because it was very specific, but I'm not sure. I don't think, maybe it's possible that they have under their governance and corruption, because sometimes they do have corruption, governance and anti-corruption measures as part of the conditionalities to ensure good governance. And so I wouldn't know about the specificities, the specific information on IFF. So maybe Christian, if you've seen that, if you've seen or it would be good to know, but I haven't seen any.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not. It's not the area of my work. I'm not quite familiar with that part. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question with regards to the issues civil society can advocate with IFIs, because sometimes we raise some issues and they say those are issues that government can only address. As IFIs, they cannot address some issues. So in terms of the scope of engagement with the IFIs, could you please advise on what are some of the issues we can raise and those we cannot raise with the IFIs when advocating with the IFIs?
If I can try to answer, I mean, I think it will depend on the institution. For instance, between World Bank and IMF, those are very different institutions. IMF has a more narrow mandate in terms of its role as an international institution. Basically ensures the stability of the international monetary system. So any issues related to that is something that it will be in one way or another tackled by IMF, issues on inequality, taxes, corruption, things like that. But it's important to understand what is the mandate of the institution, what is the core mandate that they have, and that's what is going to limit the scope of their influence or leverage. On the other hand, the World Bank is an institution that has a way more broader mandate, more flexible in terms of issues that they can take or that civil society can bring to them. It's not narrow as the IMF, it's poverty alleviation, sustainable development, and everything within the that arena of development. And their operations is also so huge in terms of different areas. So as I mentioned, just in my area of work, for instance, it goes from issues related to evictions in land operations, climate change, even civic space, the shrinking of civic space, retaliation against journalists or citizens. All those issues are issues that can easily be brought to the World Bank. But the only thing is, an important thing is that any issue bring to this institution have to be linked to their operations, either to a lending operation, to a project that they are financing. It has to have the link. Otherwise, these institutions will always argue that they don't have influence if it's a project that they don't have money on it or they don't have any kind of investment on it. So it has the two things that I will say is to take into account is understanding the mandate of the institution, and to the best of the possibilities, find a concrete link to them. Now, saying that, I also want to share and reflect that our work on these institutions is to bring systemic change to them, but in many aspects is not just bringing systemic change to these institutions, but also is to leverage their international position and within that, opening up more the relationship or the engagement with our own government. Many times we try to deal with our own governments, engage with our own governments in different areas, and sometimes it's a very closed door. But if the specific issue or sector that we are trying to engage with our government has any link with these institutions, I think that is another tool to open that door. Because as I mentioned, these institutions in essence are owned by our governments. The World Bank has 185 country members, and each country has a seat within the board of governors of these institutions, and that brings that link in terms of at least using, for instance, the policies that these institutions have in terms of transparency, of information disclosure, or in terms of engaging with stakeholders. Like the World Bank has explicit policies. We can use that just to leverage and open that relationship or that entry point with our own governments, and use these institutions as a tool for our national advocacy. So that's important for me to mention. Is engaging with this institution is not just changing them. That's important, although because they play an important role in the international community. But at the same time is when we change those institutions and we force them to come up with progressive policies, is use those as a tool to for our national advocacy. Yeah, in many times, and in my own experience, for instance, working in different countries, just because these institutions, we brought them and got them involved in a meeting with the government was in a sense forced to open the meeting, to be a little bit more forward with the civil society and the national level, because the policies that these institutions have. So it's a game of both engaging the institution, but also engaging our national governments and do advocacy involved and use them as a tool. Thank you.
If I may, Christian, that was a very good point, because one of the major experiences that I've also had with the government, and specifically the government of Kenya, is the issue of they constitute a group where they say they're involving civil society, but it's like they handpick the organizations that will be part of those discussions. And I think it's one of the major challenges we have when the World Bank, for example, will tell the government, constitute a group of civil society organizations to be part of these discussions. So the government will not really make an effort to share this information. Rather, they'll handpick organizations they feel will not cause trouble, quote unquote. But also, they don't have the time to do that kind of mapping to know which organizations are on the ground doing certain things unless you work very closely with government. So I would say one of the things is for civil society to be proactive with regards to knowing the government departments and committees that are actively seeking for participation of civil society within such discussions, but also to challenge them with regards to sharing this information, because it's not information that you get so easily. And then another challenge is the issue of credibility, even as you're speaking, Christian, that most of the, that the government really doesn't trust most NGOs. And so they have this negative perception of civil society, which also is kind of reflected to the IFIs.
Yes, totally true. I mean, we have a lot of those experiences in which, yes, the government tries to build a platform, a stakeholder platform with different NGOs, civil society for any particular discussion, but they handpick those. And if the bank or any of these institutions is involved, what we try is to use their policies in terms of stakeholder engagement, which and we push them to include other institutions or CSOs that are more critical to the government or to the institutions, and giving their policies, they cannot obstruct that. So in that sense, we use the institutions to push the government to open up the space or to disclose other type of information. So it's as you say, it's important always to keep that in mind and understand. That's what I'm saying, understand the policies that these institutions have, the structure of decision making, and use it as a tool to find pressure points for our advocacy work at the national level and at the international level.
Okay. Are there any more questions, or we can end the meeting? Hello?
Hi, none from me. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Thank you.
Okay, so now, yeah, we can end the meeting. So first, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time to attend this meeting. I believe you have learned something. So I'd like to thank Oxfam, specifically Andrew, for connecting us with the facilitators who have really helped us to understand how IFIs work and how we can effectively engage with them. Thank you, Christian and Donna, for taking time and for the good presentations. We really appreciate. We'll share this with our CSO partners that we're working with and hope they will learn. And yeah, this information, we'll use it in our advocacy with IFIs. So thank you so much. And yeah, good evening.
Thank you, Christine, Andrew, and everybody for the opportunity to have this very rich discussion. I share my presentation with Christine and Andrew, and that is also my contact information and the one of my team. So very happy to continue this discussion and reach out with any questions or anything you need. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well for having me. It has been an insightful discussion and it was great meeting the coalition members. All the best with your efforts going forward as you engage with the IFIs.
Thank you, Nona and Christian.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.